Dr. Stephen Meyer is a geophysicist and Cambridge University PhD in philosophy of science. He is a New York Times best-selling author and director of the Center for Science and Culture.
Now, the book, two main themes. I've been talking about one. The first theme is the mystery of the missing fossils, okay? And I've, in a sense, sketched out the main things that have made that mystery more acute. There's more to the story, and I tell a lot of it, and there are other evolutionary theories like punctuated equilibrium that came along that was an attempt to explain this, but the mystery of the missing fossils has grown more and more acute right up to the present time. And so the first part of the book is all about that mystery story. But then I turn a corner and I look at what is actually an even deeper, more profound mystery. Because remember, the problem of the Cambrian explosion for Darwinian theory was not just the picture of the history of life. It wasn't just that there ought to be these things down there in the earlier strata. It was actually the problem of the mechanism. How would we build an animal like this? And the question then becomes, can this mechanism of natural selection acting on random mutations generate the amount of digital code that's necessary to build a new animal? And there's different ways of quantifying the severity of that problem. I used to ask my students a question: if you want to give your computer, what do you have to? If you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? Code, software, instructions. Okay, all correct. Yes, check, check, check. Information. All right. And it turns out the same thing. This is the great discovery of 20th century biology. The same thing is true in life. If you want to build an organism, you've got to have DNA to build proteins, proteins to serve as cell types to make organs and organs and tissues to make body plans. Now, another interesting discovery, and this is in more recent times, is that the information necessary to build an animal is not entirely contained in DNA. DNA builds proteins, but the proteins have to be arranged to form structures within cells, and cell types have to be arranged to form tissues, and organs and tissues have to be arranged to form body plans. So it appears that in addition to the information that you have in DNA for building the low-level parts, you have to have information for building the higher-level structures as well. And that information now generally falls under the heading of something called epigenetic, beyond the gene information. But we've got basically an engineering problem now. And the Cambrian explosion, more than anything else in the history of life, speaks to that problem because it's the first origin of the major animal forms. So has neo-Darwinism and the mechanism that it proposes solved that problem? And in the second part of the book, I take up that question. And I want to give you a sneak preview on that, and then we'll open it up for some. Actually, I want to do two things before we finish. I want to give you a sneak preview on some of the reasons why neo-Darwinism does not provide an answer to that question. And then I want to just sketch the logic of the ID argument, of the argument for intelligent design, and why intelligent design can be understood as a positive scientific explanation for some of the key features of the Cambrian explosion, just as it is a positive explanation for the origin of the information needed to build the first life. Okay, building an animal. We know we need information, so at the very least, we've got to be able to account for new genes and proteins. And I take that question up first, and I do so by reference to an interesting conversation that started in the 1960s with some MIT physics and engineering professors, and has continued to the present day in the work of my colleague Doug Axe. How many were at Doug's talk in the morning? Okay, good. So you're going to be familiar with this. I want to relate what Doug has done to this problem of animal building in the Cambrian explosion, okay? Starting in the 1960s, there were people came together at a conference called the Wistar Institute Conference right here in Philadelphia, famous conference. MIT math, physics, computer science profs challenging their biology colleagues to put some numbers on it. You say that mutation and selection can build all these intricate structures. These guys are now in the immediate wake of the molecular biological revolution. They've come to realize that what's running the show inside cells is digital code Some of these guys are also early computer scientists, and they're saying, look, what we know about code is this. You start changing digital characters in a section of code, and you're going to degrade function before you ever find any new program. So if you're saying that the mutations are occurring in genes, and genes are sections of digital code, we don't think that this is at all plausible. This isn't mathematically plausible. The odds of this working are infinitesimally small. And they unpacked this problem with something called, a problem that came to be known as the combinatorial inflation problem. And I'm going to illustrate this with a bike lock. I did this in the last session for folks, but let's do it again. If you got a bike lock with 4 dials and 10 digits on each, you might be tempted to say you got a 1 in 40 chance of getting the combination. But of course, locks don't work that way, right? Because the dials can spin independently. If you take those first 2 dials, and you realize that for any one of those numbers, 0 through 9, each one of those numbers can match up with any one of the 10 numbers in the next dial. But that's also true for the next number on the dial in the first dial. So you actually have 10 times 10 possibilities. And you get to the third dial, and that's 10 times 10 times 10 possibilities. And so for a 4-dial bike lock, you don't have 40 possibilities. You have 10 to the 4th possibilities, or 10,000 possible combinations. Now imagine a bike lock like this. If you're a bike thief and you see one of those locks, are you going to waste your time trying to, okay? No, because you've got 10 to the 10th or 10 billion possible combinations to search. And unless you are effectively immortal, you're never going to find the right one by chance. It just, okay? The odds are overwhelmingly, it's more likely that you're not going to get it than you will overwhelmingly, okay? Now, let's apply this to proteins, which is what my good colleague Dr. Axe studies. A protein is a stretch of amino acids, okay? It's a long chain-like molecule that folds into a particular shape. If it has the right shape, it will perform a function, okay? So to get what's called a protein fold, there's a minimal level of complexity. You have to have a pretty long chain, mere 10 or 12 amino acids. And those could be little signaling molecules, little hormones or something, but they're not going to form a fold. To get a fold, you're going to need on the order of about, actually I can't remember the exact number from Doug, but he's been working with a particular protein domain of 150 amino acids to get just one fold within a protein structure. Now, the combinatorial problem associated with this is immense. How many possible ways of arranging there's 20 amino acids in each site. How many possible amino acid combinations are there corresponding to a protein of that length? Well, the answer is there's 20 to the 150th power, or in base 10, 10 to the 195th power possibilities. Now, what Doug has done is he said, okay, but now, unlike a bike lock, there's not just one combination that will be functional, that will work. So he's done some careful experimental research, and he's asked a question. And that question is this: how rare or common are the functional combinations of amino acids among that huge haystack of possible amino acids? And it turns out that, as he shared in his talk, it's a needle in a haystack, okay? The ratio of functional to non-functional combinations is 1 over 10 to the 77th power, okay? There's only 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the whole universe. So this is, an unimaginable needle in a haystack problem. And so mutation and selection effectively have to search that space of possibilities randomly in order to get even a single protein fold. And Doug's done some great calculations, others have done these, and he basically is asking for every one of these protein folds, how many corresponding non-functional sequences are there? And his answer was this scary 1 in 10 to the 77 number. But Doug also points out, Mike Behe and others have pointed out, that the total number of organisms that have ever existed on the earth are only about 10 to the 40th. And so an incredibly optimistic or generous assumption would be that every organism would generate a new gene sequence to search that space. It's unrealistic because genes have to be replicated in a accurate way to maintain life. So mutations of that scale don't occur that frequently. But on the assumption that every living form that had ever existed generated one new sequence, would you have a chance to search a significant portion of that space? Well, you might say, well, 40 over 77, that's more than half. No, you're forgetting how exponential numbers work, right? It's 10 to the 40th over 10 to the 77th, so that's actually 1 over 10 to the 37th. And a trillion is 10 to the 12th, so what that's saying is that in the whole history of life, a best-case Darwinian scenario is you're only going to search 1 10 trillion trillionth of the possible combinations of amino acids. Now let's go back to our thief again, our bike lock guy. He's spotted a bike with a big dial, okay, lots of dials, and he doesn't know combinatorics, so he says, I'm going to give this a shot. And he starts spinning the dials, hoping that he can get to it before the security guard comes around the corner. Question, is it more likely than not or less likely than not that he will succeed? Is it, correct, less is the right answer. Is it only a little bit less likely than not, or is it vastly less likely than not? It's vastly less likely than not. Now, if we formulate that as a hypothesis, here's one hypothesis, that the thief will succeed by chance, the thief will fail by chance. Which hypothesis is more likely, ergo, to be true? Okay? Do you see that second order probability, if you will, the probability of succeeding, knowing how many trials he has, is actually a measure of how likely the chance hypothesis is to be true. In other words, because it's vastly more likely that he will fail, it's also vastly more likely that the chance hypothesis is false. And somebody had that great question about the Jim Carrey question, about the guy who encounters the girl and says, what are the chances that a guy like me and a girl like you could get together? And she says, not good. And he says, well, like 1 in 100. And she says, like 1 in a million. And he says, oh, so there's a chance. And he gets all excited. Okay, when people see very small probabilities, they still want to say, hey, there's a chance. But wait, that's not the question. The question is, what's more reasonable? Is it more reasonable to think that it happened by chance or by something else? And Doug's work shows that it is overwhelmingly more reasonable to reject the chance hypothesis. Okay? The idea that the mutations search the space sufficiently to find the new genes and proteins. So what does that say? What's the bottom line? The bottom line is that the classical neo-Darwinian mechanism of mutation acting on random, or natural selection acting on random mutation is not an effective mechanism for generating even a single protein fold in the history of life. It's inefficacious. It lacks causal adequacy. And so that combinatorial inflation problem that the engineers at MIT first proposed or put forward is with us today in spades. And I have to tell you personally, I'm very proud of my colleague Doug Axe because he spent 10, 14 years very meticulously. He framed this in a way that was tractable. He performed experiments to get to the bottom of this. He wanted to know whether the mechanism had the power that was attributed to it. And the conclusion is it does not. Now this relates to a second main challenge to the creative power of evolution, because if you realize what big spaces that have to be searched, it wouldn't surprise you to find out that on a parallel track, scientists using those equations of population genetics would have come to the conclusion that even very simple structures like a protein binding site requiring 3 or 4 coordinated mutations would exceed, you'd be waiting forever for that to happen. To get one mutation to happen in a good function direction is hard, but to get 2 or 3, it's like winning the Powerball lottery. We got, the odds of getting all 6 balls to match is really, really small. And because of that, you're going to have a lot of games of lottery. You're going to have to wait a long time before you generate a winner for the really big jackpots, right? That's essentially what's going on. And I have several colleagues who've worked on that. Michael Behe, David Snoke, and Gager. Doug has made a major contribution to this. And even some of their critics are acknowledging that the waiting times involved in waiting for coordinated mutations to build a new gene or protein are off the charts. Way longer than the history of the planet. Even longer than the universe. So this is another problem, and it has a kind of irony to it. It's related to the problem of building an animal, because again, to build an animal, you got to have new genetic information. But even to build a new gene, the waiting times exceed what is reasonable in evolutionary time. And so you have this irony that the neo-Darwinian math, the mathematical expression of neo-Darwinian theory that's come out of this subdiscipline of the field called population genetics, is indicating that the neo-Darwinian mechanism doesn't have the creative power it needs to build new animals, actually new genes, let alone new animals. Two more problems. These have to do with the deeper level of what's called epigenetic information, or it's related to developmental biology. Paul Nelson has a talk in the next hour. For those who are interested in this science track, I'd recommend it. Paul has worked on developmental biology, how an animal form actually develops from embryo to full-grown organism. And it turns out that if you want to alter the developmental trajectory of an animal, you've got to get in early. Because if you allow all the cells to differentiate and go and become skin and fingernails and ears and eyes and toes, at that point, if there's a mutation someplace, it's not going to affect the whole of the unfolding cascade of differentiation of cell types. To change an animal form, you've got to mutate something real early in those earliest cell divisions. But it turns out that those are the mutations that are inevitably deleterious. They're called embryonic lethals. And so there's this interesting paradox that's come out of studies of what are called developmental mutations, early acting body plan mutations. The kind of mutations we need for major evolutionary change, beneficial early acting body plan mutations, never happen. The kind we don't need, late acting mutations in somatic cells that affect a few, those do happen, but they don't cause major changes in form. So the kind we need, we don't get. The kind we get, we don't need. Yes, mutations happen, but let's not let people get away with, well, mutations will do it, and it's just a matter of playing the odds. No, you got to have a certain kind of mutations, and the kind you need never happen, and that's based on the experimental studies of trying to mutate organisms early, okay? That's the third problem. That's the developmental mutation problem. Do you see what I'm doing here? We're stacking independent critiques upon each other, each based on different subdisciplines of biology. The mechanism is in serious trouble. The theory it's done. It's over. People don't know it yet, but it's over. The fourth critique is the critique from epigenetic information. It's the recognition that not only is there information in DNA. I got a picture of this that'll help. Yeah, this helps. This is the idea. It's the hierarchical organization, the layering of information. DNA makes proteins, but proteins have to be arranged into other structures. They form cytoskeletons. They form molecular machines. They form all kinds of different things. But then the cells in which those protein structures are contained have to be arranged to form specific kinds of tissues. In tissues, organs and tissues, body plans. So DNA does not contain all the information you need to build an animal. And I have a whole chapter on where this other information resides, what it does, but here's the bottom line. The neo-Darwinian mechanism had affirmed the idea. The advocates of neo-Darwinian mechanism say that changes in DNA generate the new forms of life. DNA is the locus of all the new form that arises. You want to build a new structure, you change DNA. Well, that's partly true because you got to have the new proteins. But there's a lot more than just having the new proteins. They have to be arranged. So those higher level assembly instructions are not subject to the same processes of mutation that affect the DNA molecule. And what this means is that the neo-Darwinian mechanism is clearly an inadequate account of the origin of form, because you could mutate DNA indefinitely till the cows come home without respect to probabilistic limits. That is to say, if Doug's probability problem wasn't even on the table, you'd have a huge problem. Because in the best case, all you would get is a new protein. You wouldn't, from that alone, build a new animal form. Okay? So this is a fourth problem. This is the problem of epigenetic information. That body plan morphogenesis is not controlled by DNA alone. Therefore, mutations in DNA do not suffice to build a new animal form of life. And yet that's what the neo-Darwinian mechanism has asserted. So those four problems are the huge problems. Now, how does any of this add up to a positive case for intelligent design? Here's my story. I got interested in all this back in the 80s, and I met a scientist named Charles Thaxton who was first putting forward the idea of what he called intelligent causes as an explanation for the origin of information necessary to build the first life. I went off to grad school because I wondered if this could be formulated as a positive scientific hypothesis. Not just Thaxton was, I think very persuasively saying there's a connection between information and intelligence. We know that from experience. It's intuitive. Information seems to be kind of mind product. And so I went to grad school thinking, I wonder if this intuitive connection could be formulated as a positive scientific argument. And as a part of that, I began to study the method of reasoning that was used in the historical sciences by scientists trying to explain what happened in the remote past. I was at that time interested in the origin of the first life. I later got interested in this Cambrian problem as well. And in the course of my studies, I came across the work of the great geologist Charles Lyell. And if people were in my breakout session, they heard me say this already, but this for me was the epiphany moment. I was reading this long, boring Victorian subtitle to his book. The book was Principles of Geology, being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. And when I got to the end of that long subtitle, a light bulb went on, and I had a great epiphany. And it's this. If we're trying to explain the origin of anything in the past, according to Lyell, we should be looking for causes which are known to be sufficient to produce the effect in question. At the time, I was interested in the origin of the information necessary to produce the first life. And I knew that all the attempts to explain that within the field I was studying, chemical evolution, had failed. But I also knew there was one cause of which we know that is capable of producing information. That cause is mind or intelligence or conscious activity. I later came across the work of an information scientist named Henry Quasler, who said that the creation of information is habitually associated with conscious activity. He wasn't making a comment on intelligent design. He was just stating an obvious fact. But then I related that to Lyell's dictum here, his principle of method. You want to explain an event in the remote past? Find the cause in the present that's known to produce that. Here's an illustration. In eastern Washington, where I went to college, there's a layer of ash, white ash, volcanic ash. If you dig down a little bit, you find it. Imagine you're a geologist and you know nothing about the May 18th, 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, but you find this layer of ash. What should you infer about what caused that? Geologists typically use a method called the method of multiple competing hypotheses. So you throw out some hypotheses. Maybe it was an earthquake. Maybe it was a flood. Maybe it was a tornado. Maybe it was a volcanic eruption. Which of those is the best explanation? Obviously the volcanic eruption, right? Why? Because it's the cause now in operation. It's the cause of which we know that has the power to produce the effect in question. We've never seen floods produce volcanic ash. They wreck other kind of habit, but not that. Same with earthquakes. Okay? So by applying the standard method of reasoning that's used in the historical sciences, in fact, the very method of reasoning that Darwin himself used, I came to the conclusion that it's possible to formulate a scientific argument for intelligent design, a scientific-based inference to the activity of an intelligent cause acting in the past. And I first applied that to the question of the origin of the first life because that is all about the origin of information. But guess what? We've got another information problem here. As Professor Lennox has said, we have another infusion of information. You can't explain the Cambrian without recognizing the need for a vast amount of new information at both the genetic and epigenetic level. And so in addition to the problem of fossils and sudden appearance, this engineering problem, I think, cries out for intelligent design as the best explanation. Because we know from experience, well, we know that the neo-Darwinian mechanism doesn't work. In the book, I show how other post-Darwinian evolutionary theories have also failed to solve the information problem. But we do know of a cause which is capable of producing a large amount of information, indeed even very quickly. And that cause is intelligence. It's conscious activity. It's the activity of a mind. And interestingly, with the Cambrian event, we not only have the digital code in DNA, we have this extraordinary layering of information, this hierarchical information. And we know of systems that have separate sources of information that are hierarchically organized. We see it in computer networks. The information, you have to have a certain amount of information to build electrical components. But then there's assembly instructions to get them on the right place in the circuit board. You got to have other assembly instructions, higher level, to get the circuit boards arranged to make the machines, and right up to the computer networks. So we layer information all the time. That's what intelligent agents do. And the Cambrian explosion attests to the origin of systems with multi-layers of hierarchically arranged information. Digital, analog, epigenetic, genetic, the whole show. Now, in the book, I look at 7 features of the Cambrian explosion, which are known from experience to have been produced by one and only one type of cause, that being intelligence. In other words, there's other things about the Cambrian that I think justify the design inference. And so I'm just highlighting 2 here relating to the big theme of this conference, which is information. Okay? So that's the logic of this. If there's only one known cause of a certain kind of effect, and you find that effect in a system, you can infer back decisively to that kind of cause. There are at least 2 features of the Cambrian animals. They're digital information and they're hierarchically organized systems of information that indicate prior intelligence, because only intelligence is the only known cause of those effects. So anyway, I'll stop there. That's a little sketch of the book.
To view this program again and share it with your friends, and to learn more about this series, these conferences, and the intersection of science and faith, please go to www.pensmore.org.
The proceeding was brought to you by the Pensmore Foundation and NRB TV.